In movies and TV shows, faking your own death is portrayed as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. Do it convincingly, and you're off the hook for any debts or grudges, off the radar of law enforcement, and off to a tropical island to live out the rest of your days in peace. In movies and TV shows, faking your own death is also portrayed as being quite easy. All you need to do is leave a scrap of your clothing somewhere fatal, and the world at large will assume you've snuffed it, almost without a moment's thought. But the reality is, it's not that easy. It's not a passport to a better life even if you do it well, and if you do it badly, it's a uniquely hellish experience for you and pretty much everyone you know. This is a truth that one man found out to his cost in 2007, when he failed to pull off one of the lowest rent, most weirdly comical fake deaths in history. This is the story of John Darwin, a man who eventually came to be better known as the Canoe Con Man. What can I tell you about John Darwin? To give the man his due, let's start with some good stuff. John Darwin was ambitious. He aspired to the very best of everything for him and his family, and he wasn't shy about working hard to try and get it. Plus, he was resourceful. If he didn't know how to do something for himself, he'd sit down, do the reading, and figure it out. And, at times, this do-it-myself attitude led to some really fun projects. He built a lot of cool stuff for his two sons, including a custom racetrack for their radio-controlled cars and a custom rabbit run for their pets. So, that's the good stuff. British eccentric, fun dad, no stranger to the grind. Now, sorry John, on to the bad stuff. Mr. Darwin was, by any reasonable standard, absolutely abysmal at almost everything he turned his hand to. You see, all his good qualities came bundled with a stubborn streak, a dream of getting very rich very quick, a dislike of spending his hard-earned cash, and a penchant for total self-delusion. Meaning that, although he was always working hard on something, it was almost always something stupid. Some examples, perhaps? In addition to working his normal job as a teacher, he started a side hustle making and painting garden gnomes. They were cheap to produce and could sell for a pretty penny at car boot sales, he believed. The only fatal flaw was that nobody wanted to buy them. Once that project had run its course, he moved on to something else that he was certain would be a surefire hit: breeding snails. That's right, giant African land snails. Giant African escargot, if we're being fancy. John never decided if he wanted to sell them as pets or as food, but it didn't matter since nobody was buying them for either reason. Business, you could say, was slow. Even though John put out lots of feelers, none of his contacts were willing to shell out for his product, and it left him in a sticky situation. He was forced to make tracks away from that particular business idea. After the snails failed, he tried some more conventional investments. He bought stocks and shares, but in hopes of a big payday, pursued such risky prospects that he only ever lost money. Still not yet wealthy, he turned to property, something he could only afford to do because of a small loan of lots and lots of British pounds from his parents. His strategy here was rather special. To save pennies, he'd buy the cheapest homes he could find, which were generally either in poor condition or situated somewhere undesirable. That's why they were cheap in the first place. He'd then do as much of the maintenance as possible himself, and therefore badly, then, more often than not, completely fail to find tenants. He even purchased one flat for just £6,000, paying for it by maxing out a credit card. A bargain, John thought, before proceeding to be shocked, dismayed, and flabbergasted that nobody wanted to live in the place. He couldn't figure out why, but I'm willing to bet it was the same reason it cost less than a second-hand car. Whatever he tried, it ended the same way, with John poorer than if he'd just picked up some extra hours at his job, and also stressed, paint-spattered, and covered in snail slime to boot. His constant companion through all of these self-imposed trials and tribulations was his wife, Anne. The pair had met as school kids when John deliberately knocked off her hat on the school bus. Not a great introduction, but when you look at it in context, that was basically one of the least annoying things he would ever do to her. Anywho, after this inauspicious meet-cute, John asked her out 20 or more times over the course of several years, until eventually she caved and said yes, and the pair was soon an item. An oddly mismatched item, it has to be said. Anne wasn't like John. Yes, she dreamed of better things, but unlike her husband, the better things she dreamed of were all things like time with her family, holidays by the seaside, and, stability and financial security and other mad flights of fancy like that. At this point, then, a moment of silence, please, for Anne, who, despite desperately wanting nothing more than a quiet and comfortable life, is going to get the exact, bizarre opposite. Okay, so, as well as being perennially harassed, Anne was also immensely loyal. She could not possibly have thought her husband, they got married by the way, was successful, but she believed he knew what he was doing, and she believed that sooner or later one of his many schemes would pay dividends, and she believed that when it did, he would take care of her. Or maybe she didn't believe any of that, and she just couldn't be bothered to argue with him about his various mad schemes. You decide. Anywho, Anne willingly or unwillingly mucked in with his schemes even if she didn't understand them, helping him maintain his ailing property portfolio and opening accounts and starting corporations in her name at his request. She even stuck by him when he had a prolonged affair with a woman he'd met through a doorstep sales scheme he was working on. Lest you think I'm being casual about John's infidelity, by the way, let's just say this is not his last affair. If I go into detail about all of them, we'll be here all night. For now, let's stick one on the extramarital affair slate and move on. He cheated, she forgave him, their rocky relationship rumbled on. They had 2 kids. John initially seemed like an unpromising father after heading home for a nap during the birth of his firstborn son. But he later deployed his fun dad mode by building them a racetrack for their toy cars in the garden. The family took modest but enjoyable holidays together and lived comfortably despite John's ham-handed attempts to make them millionaires. The boys had what they needed, and living with John kept things interesting for all of them. Yes, it wasn't perfect, but Anne had always had modest aspirations, and so she was basically pretty happy. John, less so. He wanted more. Fancy cars, nice things, status and wealth. He craved it and was prepared to take enormous risks if he thought they might pay off. The real trouble began when John started trying to expand his already wobbly property empire. Remember, his tactic was best summed up as awful properties only, and lots of them. The couple had nearly a dozen residential properties on their books, but John wanted more. Specifically, he wanted something big, grand, and by the seaside. Hence, he uprooted Anne and the kids and moved them to the coastal idyll of Seaton Carew to live in a big old mansion by the sea. On the surface, a sound decision. The property was actually 2 neighbouring buildings sandwiched together, with interconnecting doors built in. It had 14 bedrooms. The Darwins would occupy a few, and they'd rent out the rest to tenants, meaning the property would pay for itself. Unfortunately, as it turned out, reality didn't live up to the hype. Their beautiful seaside property was incredibly old, drafty, and run down. It cost a fortune to heat, looked like cold garbage on the inside, and nobody wanted to live there. They struggled constantly to find tenants, and their finances went from bad to worse as a result. And to compound it, the type of mortgage John had chosen meant they couldn't even sell any of their other properties to alleviate their mounting debt. Soon, they owed £60,000, and stress levels within the house were through the leaky and broken down roof. The kids, now adults, had moved out, and the pair were trying to manage a 14-bedroom mansion and a bank balance of negative £60,000 alone. And they ended up, I think you'll agree, not handling the stress particularly well. It wasn't long before John started joking about faking his own death. And then it wasn't long before John started not joking about faking his own death. Tentatively, Anne suggested that he declare bankruptcy instead. A solution that wouldn't feel great and would mean a drastic change of lifestyle, but which would basically get them through the crisis, otherwise unscathed. John thought about it for 0 seconds, then declared that no, they were going to do the faking his own death thing. And that, viewer, was exactly what they did. Of all the ways he could possibly go, John decided that mysterious canoe accident would be the most dignified. One morning, he took his trusty red canoe out to sea, made sure he was seen by plenty of witnesses, and then paddled for the far horizon. His plan had been to fake an accident, but no sooner had he got out to sea than he almost drowned for real in the relatively flat, calm ocean. Typically for John, he was an enthusiastic but not very competent canoeist, and his vessel was laden down with camping equipment. He very nearly managed to secure himself the most appropriate Darwin Award in history. With a desperate effort, he just about made it back to shore, landing bedraggled and exhausted in a quiet cove. There, he flung his jacket into the ocean, ditched his paddle, and sunk his canoe, then hid out in the dunes until Anne could come pick him up under the cover of night. She took him to the train station and dropped him off so that he could make his getaway. He would spend the next several weeks camping in a forest. Anne, meanwhile, would have the much more difficult job of selling the lie. And it was harrowing. She lied to the police and maintained that lie while a search and rescue operation costing hundreds of thousands of pounds and risking the lives of dozens of volunteers took place, scouring the ocean for the man who she knew was safely roasting marshmallows over a campfire down south. Then she had to break the news to her family, John's family, and her own children. One of her boys had been on a trip to Niagara Falls, about to propose to his girlfriend. He ended up calling off the proposal and rushing back home, fully believing that his father was lost at sea. Anne was not a natural-born liar, and the police were suspicious. The search of the sea was followed by a search of their house, and several relentless interrogation sessions. But Anne held her ground, and eventually the searches of every kind were called off, and the heat died down. When a beach walker found a fragment of John's red canoe, identifiable by the wicked cool killer whale John had etched on the side, it was enough for the police to declare John Darwin missing, presumed dead. This paved the way for the next part of John's ludicrous plan. He would change his appearance by, wait for it, growing a beard and wearing sunglasses, then return home to live with Anne in secret under a new false identity. Now, though the investigation was slowly going cold, the police were still popping by for the odd surprise visit every now and then. And Anne, to all the world a grieving widow, was being relentlessly visited by friends, family, and well-wishers. None of these people could be allowed to see John up close, and so anytime the doorbell rang, he would initiate a special security protocol and scurry next door to one of the rental bedsits through a connecting door. Later on, when they had to remove the connecting doors to subdivide the two properties for possible sale, they kept one secret tunnel active for John by the simple expedient of hiding it in a cupboard. Now, if you think this sounds like an absolutely insane way to live, you're right. It was. In later interviews, both John and Anne paint vivid pictures of the misery and madness of this time. John lived a bizarre half-life, barely speaking to anyone. He still had to maintain the house, and so he told tenants that he was Anne's new handyman, and that his name was Carl Fenwick. If any of them saw through the lie, they weren't bothered enough to say anything. He was able to potter around the house and risk the occasional trip out into town, but each sally out from the house was fraught with risk. Most of the time, to stay safe and hidden, he remained hunkered in his secret bedsit playing video games online. When reflecting later on, John took a maniacally look-on-the-bright-side attitude to this imprisonment. When asked by an interviewer how he felt about being confined to the attic for days at a time, he took umbrage and pointed out that he wasn't locked in the attic, he was locked in the master bedroom. Much better. While John struggled with how little he had to do, Anne was overwhelmed by how much now fell on her shoulders. She had to run John's various business ventures for him, maintain house and home, and maintain the lie of being a widower for everyone who happened by. With a lot of things, John would direct and Anne would do. He, for example, wrote letters to the life insurance company. Anne would correct his typos, sign them with her name, and send them out. Likewise, albeit somewhat weirder, If the boys had a question that Dad would have known the answer to, she could actually ask him and get back to them with the answer. Incredibly, he'd sometimes even be in the room with her when she took calls from the boys, jotting down advice and answers on a piece of paper for her to relay. It was a lot of work for Anne, leading John to remark without a hint of irony, it's always without a hint of irony with John, that he didn't know how she'd have coped if he did actually die. And to make all this exhausting rigmarole worse, they were still in debt. Indeed, the life insurance and various other insurances John had been hoping to claim wouldn't pay out for a whole year, because that's about how long it takes to get a death certificate in hand when there isn't a body and you're acting really suspiciously. But despite everything, John was eventually officially declared dead. He was delighted. Actual quote here from him to Anne, "I'm a genius." It was the light at the end of the tunnel for the pair. The only problem for Anne was that, alas, John was still alive. But in light of around £250,000 in various bogus insurance claims landing in her account, she was able to forgive even that. The sum cleared their most pressing debts and put them in a much more financially secure position. To celebrate, John smashed out another affair with an American woman he met while playing EverQuest. In a brilliant 2-for-1, she also scammed him out of £20,000. But at least, with his fake death having become official, he could now afford it. Anyhow, back to the matter at hand. As time went on, it became more and more clear to the Darwins that they couldn't live in the UK. The chance that someone would eventually recognise John was and always had been 100%, and staying in the same tiny seaside town after faking your own death with only a beard and a pair of sunglasses preventing your immediate discovery was, and always had been, Looney Tunes level delusional. They started looking for somewhere else to go. Somewhere exotic, somewhere free, somewhere a bit more lawless. John initially considered buying a catamaran and sailing the seven seas, but got scammed out of a relatively piddling £1,000 when he actually tried to buy a boat. After some other misadventures, he landed on Panama. Lovely, far away, inexpensive, slightly dangerous Panama. Never one to do things by halves, John and Anne committed to buying an apartment there and also a patch of untamed jungle that they wanted to turn into an eco-resort. Neither Darwin had any experience running anything of the kind, and they could barely agree on what an eco-resort actually was. Still, that was the plan. John headed out there using a fake passport he'd acquired with a stolen birth certificate, and Anne followed, telling friends and family that she just really needed a long holiday. Place your bets now on whether they ever managed to build that eco-retreat. Okay, congrats, you're right. They never even got started. They bought one machete and took a bus out to look at their plot of land. It was in a region known as Colon, which, just to clarify, is not me mispronouncing Cologne, it was actually called Colon. It was a region that had historically been visited by Christopher Columbus, but he had decided against colonizing it, as it just wasn't worth the risk in his opinion. The land was wild, rocky, thick with jungle, and infested with poisonous snakes, poisonous spiders, and non-poisonous but still inconvenient howler monkeys. It also had no running water or electricity, and had been used for fly tipping by the locals for years. Of course, John loved it. Anne wasn't so sure, but either way, before they could even get started, they ran into visa trouble. John was on a tourist visa, and to get a permanent one, he'd need a letter from his local police force back home. The police force that had just recently spent hundreds of thousands of pounds searching for him before asserting that he was dead. That police force. No problem, said John. He'd take a leaf out of the soap opera playbook and pop back over, hand himself in and say he was suffering from amnesia. Everyone would be happy to see him. The cops wouldn't ask any awkward questions. He could get his letter of good standing, tell his 2 grieving sons that he's okay after all, then hop back over to Panama to get started on the eco-lodge. John was a man who'd had a frankly extraordinary number of bad ideas in his life. This one had to be his masterpiece, though. He genuinely, hand on heart, thought that it wouldn't be that big a deal. That amnesia basically explained everything, and that if he pitched it just right, his insurers would sock him on the shoulder, call him an old rascal, buy him a beer, and let him keep the $250,000 he'd scammed them out of. It didn't pan out that way. John went back to England and handed himself in, keenly mugging the most logically inconsistent case of amnesia the UK police force had ever seen. He remembered his wife, his sons, and his pet dogs, but not how he took his coffee. He couldn't recall 9/11 and had also forgotten what baked beans were. Conversely, he insisted that he liked hunting rabbits, something he'd never done in his life. He also had no idea who he was, but thought that he was probably a missing person. It wasn't terrifically convincing, especially when paired with John's very evident suntan. But the police just took his word for it at first. They called John's sons and informed them of their father's miraculous return, upending their lives for the second time in 6 years. The story, heartwarming rather than scandalous at that stage, made a small splash in the local press. But a small splash was all it took. Within hours, an enterprising newspaper reader had hopped onto Google, literally just typed in the words John, Anne, and Panama, and immediately found a picture of John and Anne posing with a Panamanian estate agent when they purchased their plot of land. The picture reached the police, who already found John a little bit suspect. Now, with evidence in hand, they arrested the bejesus out of him. Anne was still in Panama. The police didn't dispatch anyone to go get her. They just waited. The story was so juicy that, within hours, a feral mob of journalists was battering down the door of Anne's apartment. A couple of them escorted her home, and she too was arrested on landing back in the UK. Side note, guess how many submachine-wielding armed officers they send to detain one woman in her 60s? 5. The answer is 5. Anywho, the Darwins were interrogated at length. They stuck to their story for a while, but eventually Anne couldn't take the pressure and spilled the beans. John was still insisting he didn't know what beans were at this stage, but confronted with his wife's confession, he dropped the admittedly mediocre act and came clean. They had faked everything. So, of course, they were prosecuted. The trial attracted an almost indecent amount of media attention, and the papers printed all sorts of mad rumours, the main one being that the couple had stashed their fortune somewhere in Panama. They hadn't, of course. That would have been far too competent. UK authorities were eventually able to claw back most of the insurance money and a little bit extra for the inconvenience. John pled guilty and got 6 years and 3 months. Anne, after a lot of agonising, tried to fight against conviction on the basis it was all John's idea. The court didn't buy it. Yes, it had all been John's idea, but she had participated in it all so actively that it had sort of become her thing as well. She got 6 years and 6 months in jail, 3 months longer than her husband. And that was pretty much the end of it. The news stories kept coming for a while, but at this point the papers were just sort of making stuff up to milk the story. It was all basically over. John and Anne were both disowned by their children, who'd had enough stupid shenanigans to last a lifetime. Both served their sentences and were eventually released back into the wild. When he talks about the whole affair... speaking of, John had another affair at the end of his prison sentence. When he talks about the whole affair, John gives a masterclass in soliciting sympathy and then losing it. In a radio interview he did with Victoria Derbyshire, for example, he speaks eloquently about the pain and stress and panic and grief of the situation he got himself and his wife into. How lonely it was hiding in plain sight, seeing his family and having to pretend he was a stranger, and having to pretend he was dead to his own sons lest he implicate them in his awful crime. And then, just when you're starting to feel sorry for the guy, he shoots himself in the foot at point-blank range. "Look," he says, "I was under a lot of stress. What I did wasn't great, but it wasn't as bad as murdering my entire family." He actually makes this point more than once, unprompted, in a way that quite strongly suggests he did consider murdering his entire family. So, in a way, well done for not doing that, but also that's a pretty low bar. Anywho, after his release from prison, John went on to self-publish a book about his, for want of a better word, adventures. It's no longer available, and I'd imagine that has more to do with him being forbidden from making any profits from speaking or publishing works about his crimes than it does with it selling out. He also, in a completely bananas move, initiated a divorce. That's right, he divorced Anne on grounds of unreasonable behaviour because she refused to talk to him. Oof. Last John was heard of, he was happily remarried and living in the Philippines with a bride half his age. Good luck to him, and, given his track record, good luck to her as well. As for Anne, she's a changed woman. She used her spell in prison to learn some new skills and slowly and painfully re-establish contact with her kids, and, after a few years, grandkids too. She now lives quietly and anonymously in a very sleepy, very ordinary village. She finally got the peaceful, simple life she was looking for. She also made one other change in prison, and that was the biggest change she could possibly have made. She decided to finally and firmly cut John out of her life. It was tough. He wanted to speak to her. He inundated her with letters. They had spent more than 30 years joined in holy matrimony, and she had never really been on her own before. They had been through so much together. It took everything she had to decide that she wanted rid of him, and when he served her with divorce papers, she signed them without hesitation, and made it clear she never wanted to see him again. I'm inclined to think that, for John, the Canoe Con was his destiny. He would always have ended up doing something like this. That's just the way he was made. But for Anne, how different things could have been for her had she made the decision to leave John a little earlier on. When he had his first affair, perhaps, or when he went home for a nap while she was giving birth. Or perhaps even decades ago now, when they first met, as children on the bus to school, and the very first thing he did was to knock her hat off. Perhaps if she'd taken that as a sign of things to come, she'd have had a very different, very quiet, very happy life, after all.